This is the title of a book that I wrote recently, which David Childress is going to publish. And I chose the name because there is a phenomenon that exists on the coast of Peru and Polynesia involving auburn-colored hair amongst ancient native people. So this occurs not only on the coast of Peru, but also here, New Zealand, Tahiti, and Hawaii. And so, as far as I'm concerned, it kind of breaks the idea that the Polynesians exclusively came from Southeast Asia. And it's something that I saw in person when I was living in Hawaii quite a few years ago. I met people who had this color of hair, and I said, well, is that European? And they'd say, no, that's from the first people. You know, earlier than the Hawaiians, earlier than, you know, the different conventional Polynesian
There's an
people.
island in Samoa where they all have blonde hair.
What's that?
There's an island in Samoa, where they've all got blonde hair, pure blonde hair, until about mid to late 20s, dark. They reckon it's some gene that
Yeah, well, I've read that, you know, they're trying to explain it away as being a genetic defect or something, but I think it deals with ancient ancestry.
But that's good, because if you call it defect, but if it's different, then you could say, well, it's not Irish, or it was Irish, or...
Well, yeah, and this is it's spoken of in terms of pre-contact. So, this is the area, this is the area that I'm kind of concerned with, or was exploring, where we are, and the west coast of South America into what is called Polynesia. And of course, some of you will have heard of this concept of there being a continent in the Pacific called Mu or Lemuria, which is talked about, especially by Churchward, who wrote a number of books about it in the early 20th century, about this continent. But I think one thing that he got wrong was that I don't think it was actually a continent. If you know anything about Polynesian people, you know that today, and the same centuries ago, they're very much aquatic people, water people. Even today, a lot of people in Hawaii spend as much time as possible in and around the ocean. So I think when it comes to the ancient legends and storytelling, when they speak of this geographic related area, they weren't speaking about a landmass. They were speaking about the opposite, actually. They're speaking about an area of the ocean, with the islands themselves being like the cities, because being a navigating people, their concept of territory is different from ours. And other ancient, drawings of the fact that possibly there was in ancient times there could have been a sea in South America that connected the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, with so-called Atlantis being in the Atlantic. But it's in modern, in very recent times, through the research of many very gifted people, that we're starting to get an inkling of the fact that there could very well have been very ancient societies, sophisticated societies, ocean traveling societies, prior to what conventional books tell us, including the work of this man. And so Dr. Schock has illuminated us about his and Katie's ideas about where Rongo Rongo came from, and various other anomalies that we've seen on Rapa Nui, Easter Island, that don't fit with the conventional story of seagoing people showing up and slowly building a society. We've seen evidence of very interesting megalithic structures, which could very well have preceded what we see in conventional stories about Polynesians.
You know that the Maori people think that the word Maori is a corruption of the word Muri.
What's that?
The Maori people think that the Maori name is a corruption of Lemuria. They were the people of the moon.
Okay.
And words like Mauritania, Mauritius, any word with that in it. is
Mauritius. Okay.
And
Well-
Moor is the same.
Okay.
The Moorish people.
Yeah. Well, you know, like Dr. Schock's work ties in very well with the work of this woman. And this is Barbara Hand Clow. And she wrote a book called Catastrophobia. And it was based initially on teaching she learned from her grandfather, who was a Cherokee wisdom keeper, about the fact that this very traumatic thing happened to the planet basically around, 12,000 years ago. And then she was able to meet up with scientists who were not very well known, who were telling the same story. So Dr. Schock's story, her story, and the work of others lock into place with one another. And all of this is very, quite recent, within the last 10 years or so, that something devastating happened to this planet, wiping out history, more or less. Graham Hancock talks about a period of amnesia lasting at least 3,000 years, where society was in such confusion that it had to reinvent itself. And so everyone knows this boat called the Kontiki, which Thor Heyerdahl built. And he and some of his Norwegian friends, who had just made it out of the Second World War battling the Nazis, they were agents basically. And so by the end of the war, these guys had so much guts and had seen so much trauma that building a balsa raft boat and sailing across the Pacific was basically nothing to them. The thing is that their concept was based on research that Heyerdahl made, reading ancient accounts of the fact that on Easter Island, stories were written about of these other people, or people other than Polynesians, people who had red hair, even blonde hair, were very tall, and some were light-skinned. And so Heyerdahl and his men traveled in 1947 from the port of Callao, where Irene's from, and over the course of, I think it was 104 days, they were able to make it to Coral Atolls, which are part of the Society Islands. The one thing that they didn't do is they never tried to steer Kontiki. They simply always tried to keep the sail as close to being behind the wind as possible. Of course, they knew where Polynesia was, so the fact that they landed there was no great surprise. The one mistake I think they made was their sail design, because there is no such sail in the Pacific Ocean that looks like that. That's more something you find in Europe. So very inefficient. They never tried to really steer it that well. And so that's probably why it took 104 days to complete this, because the currents naturally go up the west coast of South America and move into Polynesia prior to reaching the equator. This is another ship, lesser known. It's called the Viracocha. There were two of them, Viracocha 1, Viracocha 2. This one left more or less the border of Peru and Chile in 2000 and made it to Easter Island in 44 days, showing that a reed boat made out of Totora with a proper sail design like this one, which is far more efficient than a square sail, could make it in, a month plus. And this is of course, the difference between talks that I give and this one is the fact that you're actually standing on this island. But here we have Easter Island with all the massive moai, ringing, more than 950 of them, ringing the island, and some inland, which we, have seen. The conventional story, of course, is that all native people of the Americas came from Siberia across the Bering Land Bridge while it was dry land prior to the end of the Ice Age. But that's a very limited story because it doesn't take into account the fact that people might actually have the intelligence of being able to build some kind of craft that can float, and not only float, but also be propelled by wind. And not only that, but maybe these people were smart enough to know how celestial navigation works. And so, you know, of course, supposedly these people walked across the Bering Land Bridge and made it all the way down to, you know, the tip of Tierra del Fuego in the south. And the timeline is now being broken by various insights from different researchers. My main area of interest has been the area called Baracus. Oops, scratch on. Baracus, which is south of Lima. And Irene and I first went there about 2 years ago because the phenomenon of the elongated skulls intrigued me and her. And there, a number of the skulls had this very interesting auburn-colored hair, which is not a characteristic of most Native American people, because as you can see from Irene, they, you know, almost 99, if not 100% of the time have black hair. So my question was, where did this come from? And I was thinking back when I saw this about stories I had heard and people I had known on Hawaii who had this characteristic. The conventional story about Polynesian migration is that they came from Southeast Asia about 4000 BC, made it through Papua New Guinea around 1500 BC, and then to Fiji, and then Tahiti, and then from Tahiti is where they spread out to become the so-called Polynesians. Hawaii about 600 AD, New Zealand, known as Aotearoa, about 1250, and then here in Rapa Nui about 700, but the numbers depend upon the researcher that you talk to. And this is basically what the Polynesian Triangle is known as. It's Hawaii in the north, Easter Island in the southeast, and New Zealand, Aotearoa in the southwest. And there's the dog. And so basically,
Like what you just said.
yeah, basically these related people live in what is called the Polynesian Triangle, as depicted here. But today we were at this place, Anakena, and here you can see, you know, Thor Heyerdahl found remains of megalithic structures underneath the ground, and they have been since covered up because we actually walked across that today. And as we have seen, you have these Moai characters with these red adornments on their heads. Some researchers say that they're a kind of hat, but as you've noticed, Senor Enrique and others call them top knots, as in that is the way that Native people, even to this day, wear their hair. One of the reasons why they do is because of the heat. If you have your hair down around your shoulders, you know, you're going to cook, so you tie it up in a top knot. And of course, Kontiki is based upon an ancient South American being called Viracocha, not to be confused with Viracocha. Viracocha was the creator god. Viracocha was the man or the people sent by Viracocha to educate the people. And they're described as being tall, light-skinned, and I don't like to use the word white-skinned because that is racist, but this light-skinned people, supposedly fair-haired, possibly blue-eyed, very tall, who came and lived in the area of Titicaca, the area of Cusco, and then drifted north, or some people say were forced north, and out of the area. There they reached the coast and supposedly sailed away, never to be seen again. And Viracocha, when you translate it, means the foam of the sea. Now the Inca and the Viracochans supposedly lived on or near the island of the sun, which is depicted here. And this is an Inca construction, Inca period construction. Another story relates that they came from the area of Tiwanaku, which is here, reasonably close by. But the difference between this picture and that picture is the complexity of the architecture. This is very simple, and for those who have been on the trip through Cusco and the Sacred Valley, I think we've reasonably well explained to you that this is how the Inca built things this, and the Inca did not build like this, because this is this is a megalith, a single chunk of stone, many tons of andesite that comes from the area of Copacabana and was moved to the site of Tiwanaku somehow. This is a depiction of who, probably not Viracocha, but the Viracochans looked like, holding these enigmatic staffs. And that is where, of course, Tiwanaku is. It's not that far from the Pacific. And, again, this talk is different because, of course, all of you have seen this. Usually I'm giving this presentation to people who have never been to the area. As we saw, the construction there is very complicated, or at least the original structures, the megalithic stone, you're talking megatonnage, or at least, upward, many tons of these single blocks were, and they were moved, the red sandstone 5 to 10 kilometers away, the andesite up to 60 or 70 kilometers away. Not something that a primitive culture probably could have done. Again, this, of course, this we saw. And this is a depiction of pottery from the Tiwanaku area. The top of the head looks a little bit like a moai, but you can't really infer that. I'm just showing that as a possibility. Then, of course, in Cusco, we saw the Coricancha. Sail design, ship design varies based upon where you are on the planet, because it will vary not only based upon the materials available, but based upon the conditions. So a Viking ship would not work very well in the tropical Pacific because the wind and current conditions are far different. So this sail design is very much like a Hawaiian sail design, except the Hawaiian sail is actually upside down, but you see that this is a foil shape as compared to a square sail. The other quandary that Heyerdahl had was the presence of this, the sweet potato, which is found in Hawaii, New Zealand, here, and Tahiti. It's native to Central America and is also found in South America. So how did it wind up in the Pacific Ocean in Polynesia? It clearly didn't float. This is an ancient carving of a sweet potato that was found in Hawaii. This is a can of dog food that contains sweet potatoes from New Zealand. And the Totara reed. We saw the Totara growing in Lake Titicaca. It's also native to the west coast of Peru, or to the coast of Peru, from the south end to the north end, where they still build small craft out of it. Such as, this man we actually met, the maker of the Ratu, also the maker of the Viracocha and other craft. And these are the present day boats which are found on the coast of Peru, and they are called toras, as in Totora, but the craft itself is called tora. And interestingly, linguistically, similar craft used to be made on Rapa Nui, and they are called poras in the native language. You take one letter, you just simply change one letter, and you have the name of the same craft. This, we saw, is where the Totora grows to this day. And this is another story from the Peruvian coast, but this is up in northern Peru, and it's a character, or actually probably real person, called Nilap, who was a great voyager who took off into the Pacific Ocean and came back telling stories of interesting exotic lands that he had visited. So it's in the oral tradition of the coast of Peru that people did move out from the coast into the Pacific and came back. And also during Inca times, the Inca Tupac Yupanqui, who was one of the last of the Incas, there is a story, a story that he left from Ecuador, and over the course of 18 months, or some stories say 2 years, he left the coast, went off to these islands, two of which are thought to have been Mangareva and Rapa Nui, and returned back with exotic people and exotic products. This man is Julio C. Teo, who is the god of Peruvian archaeology, and I've had a frustrating time trying to do research about the area of Baracus, because he is, in the 20th century, he was the expert on the culture, but unfortunately, because he's regarded by most scholars as being the god, and now that he's dead, he becomes even more of a god. He lived before the time of carbon-14 testing or genetic testing, but even so, his word is basically gospel. And I think clearly he got a number of things wrong. His expertise was also in the area of Chavin, Chavinda Huantar. That was one of his major discoveries, north of Lima. But these people died out 2,000 years ago, leaving no descendants. They were overtaken by the Nazca culture, and that's when, it's a different talk, but that's when the elongation, whether it was cranial deformed or natural, that phenomenon disappeared. And so basically did the red hair. You see a little bit of evidence amongst the first of the Nazca, but then it disappears.
Can I just make a quick point in that DNA gets caught in the hair? So we talked about using teeth as a source for DNA analysis. Hair is also very good.
Oh, hair's good?
Yeah, because as it grows, the cells die, and the DNA gets caught in the keratin of the hair. And so again, a lot of the main problem is just
Contamination.
contamination.
Oh, okay.
But what you do is you wash the outside, so be sure that the only thing you get is things that have been caught inside the hair.
Oh, okay.
So it might be another source for your friend.
Okay, good, thank you. Yeah. This is just to show you, for those who have never been to Baracus, examples of the elongated skulls as compared to the one on the right, which is a normal skull. And my local source on Rapa Nui told me that in ancient times there were people who had, this phenomenon. Whether that is a cultural trait or a genetic trait, we don't know. The Nazca figures, Senor Juan Navarro, who's the director of the Baracus Museum, theorizes that this actually was a navigational device because you can only see it from the ocean. Most local guys say that it represents a cactus, but what Senor Juan theorizes is that it actually represents the Southern Cross, but the mirror reflection of the Southern Cross. Amongst the archaeological material of the Baracus, we find on the left is spondulus shell, which is only found on the coast of Ecuador. So clearly 2,000 plus years ago there was trade between Ecuador and Baracus, and it's more likely that was done via boat or rather than land, because it's a lot faster and more efficient to sail up and down the coast than it is to walk. 80% of the time the wind blows from the south to the north, but 20% of the time it blows from the north back to the south. So a journey, even with quite a primitive sailing craft, isn't complex from the Baracus area to Ecuador and back. And once you reach Ecuador, that's when you naturally get pulled into this current and wind system that would pull you into the Pacific. This craft, called the Hokulea, which has come here many times, that in 1976 showed very obviously that ancient movement from Tahiti, or from Hawaii to Tahiti and back, solely using celestial navigation was clearly possible, and it's completed that route many times. It's come here, which is a very difficult trip without the use of a compass. It's been to New Zealand, etc. And this man was the Micronesian navigator, Ma'apialag, who was able to guide Hokulea without the use of a compass or watch or charts or anything like that, from Hawaii to Tahiti and back. The conventional story, again, of the movement of the so-called Polynesians or Proto-Polynesians is based upon what's called Lapita pottery, which shows up in the Fiji area, Vanuatu, and some researchers have claimed that this is the benchmark of the migration of what was to become the Polynesian people. The homeland of the so-called Polynesians is the island of Raiatea, because it's right in the center of what is called the Polynesian Triangle. So it in ancient times was the place where all these related people would go to meet each other, because they are all related. For example, Benjamin, his last name is Paoa, which is a very prominent name also in Hawaii. And this is the cartoon-like movement of the people. This is supposedly Hotumatua leaving the area of the Society Islands to find this mysterious little island called Rapa Nui here. And again, with the top knots, again, some researchers think that is a hat or design of some kind, but there is no such thing in any other part of Polynesia where there is hair adornment that looks that way. And again, with the work of Dr. Robert Schock, looking at at how ancient a structure is in terms of physical evidence as compared to ethnographic evidence, Dr. Schock has shown us very obviously that the Sphinx, for example, predates the pharaonic period of Egypt. Here, one of the moai being dug down. Most people think that they're simply heads, but now we know that they are complete bodies, some of them huge in size. And the question being, were they buried on purpose? Which is the oral tradition says they were buried on purpose. Dr. Schock believes that the sediment is the result of thousands of years, probably, of literally of sedimentation. We always get bombarded by this question of a tsunami hitting and burying them, but of course, as Dr. Schock would say, they would have all been knocked down by the wave. And yet, so many, at least 200 of them are standing up.
Could I ask, and maybe this is for Robert,
Good.
when you do the excavation, wouldn't the soil of something being buried have lost its integrity of the surrounding soil? So it'd be pretty obvious that it was buried.
It would be obvious if they had actually been buried purposefully. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So
it would be obvious.
Just integral.
Exactly, and there's no evidence of that.
There's no evidence
That they were buried purposefully. Well, there's no evidence that they dug a hole and stuck these things in and buried them.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so if the soil built up naturally, we're talking
You're talking about a very long time.
More than 12,000?
Maybe.
Okay, yeah. Can you give us a ballpark figure or not at all? Not at this
I
point?
wouldn't want to guess.
Okay.
Because I haven't seen any of these excavations. Remember, we couldn't get there. And
Yeah.
this one is Thor Higher Dolls, which was filled back in. So
Right.
we don't have the data.
But it's very interesting that the thumbs flip up like in Quebec. That's you don't see that in a lot of moai.
Yeah.
Well, actually, and actually the oral, the
1960 or 75?
late 50s, I think. Yeah. It's when he wrote Aku Aku. And actually, some of the local people say that there are more of these moai, but they're buried completely.
I think that's quite conceivable.
Oh yeah?
I mean, especially if you have shorter ones. We know they're shorter and taller. How tall some of these are, they could be complete moai.
Yeah, it's true. And of course, we did see this at Vinapu, which is very distinct compared to most of what we've seen on the island. There were a couple of sites that had short segments of walls that were very tight as compared to the rest, which is what you find in Hawaii. You find just like piled stuff, piled natural volcanic stones, sometimes shaped a little bit, but this is like, this is what Heyerdahl was one of the first people to look at and say that reminded him of what he saw in Cusco.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure, no, yeah.
This is something that Matthew has, and this was referring to the new excavations from the Easter Island Statue Project. And here, I'll just read a quote which confirms what I just said. The dirt and detritus partially bearing the statues was washed down from above and not deliberately placed there to bury, protect, or support the statues. And that's the conservative, very ultra-conservative Easter Island project saying that.
Wow.
It was excavated.
Uh-huh.
So I mean, that's confirming that it's built up naturally over a long period of time.
Wow.
I don't know, but they don't put two together that. You know, when you've got 5-6 meters of sediment, that takes a long time to wash down.
Oh,
You're
yeah.
not doing it catastrophically. If you were doing it catastrophically, as you just pointed out, and as I've said before, it would knock you down.
Mm-hmm.
But this is way up in the caldera.
Yeah, and then the caldera, and you're not going to get a lot of sediment from there.
Right.
So it'll be particularly slow there.
As we were leaving the volcanic crater yesterday, I found a moai that most people probably walk right by, don't even realize it's a moai. Completely face down, Robert and Kate were with me, and it looked like it could have been washed up there.
They have to get a sample though at some point, somehow. Putting it in your suitcase and wanting to go to jail. But this picture actually, this is from Captain Cook's expedition in the 1770s. And it shows even at that time the moai were still standing. So the conventional idea that in the and actually Jared Diamond, who wrote a book called Collapse, is I think way off base, because he's one of the people who said that there was this major internal war prior to European contact, and that all the moai were knocked down, etc., etc. This is Captain Cook's crew 50 years after Roggeveen, who was supposed to be the first European, and many of the moai were still standing. It's more likely that the moai destruction happened as the result of disease and the Catholic Church.
Brian, if we could go back to that picture just a sec. What are the things on the side of their heads?
Those are the long ears.
Long ear.
Uh-huh.
That
Well,
was the
they're
artist's
represented.
interpretation.
It could be, there's a
Not
possible
necessarily ears,
connection.
but
Yeah. Now, here we have the horse. I mean, this slideshow makes a difference seeing 4,000 horses today. But this goes to show just that a lot of the devastation that happened on the island was not the result of the people chopping down the last tree. It's the fact that, you have these sheep and horses, etc. Destroying the
Brian, what did you have for lunch today?
hamburger.
I thought it was a horse burger.
Horse burger today.
Yeah.
Well, this shows you, this is Hawaiian adornment, so it's nothing like what the pukao, the red, red adornment looks like on the moai here. It's more like that. This man's a Maori from New Zealand, and there you see the traditional way the hair is worn, like that. And this guy actually was there today. So again, according to the local informant, when I said, wow, is he part Irish or Scottish? She said, no, that is from the Tukey family line. They naturally look that way. And I said, is that ancient? And she said, yes, that is a very ancient feature that some Rapa Nui people still have. And they're in detail. So it's not actually, the photos aren't that great, but it's not actually red hair. It's an auburn which is bleached by the sun. This interesting language called Rongo, which is not found elsewhere in Polynesia except here. Some people say that there are other related examples in the Indus Valley. There are supposedly related examples in Peru, written about, but no real examples that are able to be seen.
Similar